Dying girl with cancer had final wish. Patrick Mahomes' unbelievable response left her family in tears. The antiseptic scent of the hospital room had become as familiar to Sophie as the smell of her own home. At 8 years old, she had spent more time in these sterile, white walls than on playgrounds or at birthday parties. The steady beep of monitors have replaced the laughter of classmates, and the cool touch of medical equipment have replaced the warm hugs of friends. Sophie Miller stared out the window of her hospital room, watching as raindrops raced down the glass. She traced their paths with her thin finger, making a game of which droplet would reach the bottom first. These small distractions were her escape from reality. A reality where cancer was slowly stealing away her childhood. "Which one are you betting on, Soph?" Daniel Miller asked, looking up from the sports magazine he had been pretending to read. His military-trained posture couldn't hide the exhaustion in his eyes. A father who hadn't properly slept in months. "The fat one," Sophie replied, with a grin that still somehow lit up her pale face. "It's like Patrick Mahomes. Looks like it might get blocked. But then whoosh. It finds a way through," Daniel smiled, marveling at his daughter's spirit. Even with tubes running into her arms, and monitors tracking her failing body's every function, Sophie found joy in the smallest things. And always, there was Patrick Mahomes. The football star had become Sophie's beacon of hope. Long before her diagnosis, she had watched him play with her father since she was 5, memorizing his statistics and mimicking his movements in their backyard before cancer made such activities impossible. What began as a father-daughter bonding activity had transformed into something far more significant during her illness. Patrick Mahomes wasn't just a football player to Sophie. He was proof that impossible odds could be overcome, that underdogs could triumph, that miracles existed. "Daddy, can we watch the highlight reel again?" Sophie asked, her voice softer than it had been just weeks ago. Daniel reached for the tablet by her bedside. "Of course, squirt." Game 7 against Denver, Sophie nodded enthusiastically, her eyes already brightening with anticipation. As Daniel pulled up the video, Dr. Ramirez entered the room, her face a carefully composed mask that did little to hide the gravity of her news. She gestured for Daniel to join her in the hallway. "I'll be right back, Soph." "Start without me," Daniel said, pressing play on the video before following the doctor out in the sterile hallway underneath fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and pale. Dr. Ramirez's professional composure cracked slightly. "The latest scans," she began, her voice dropping. "The treatment isn't working as we'd hoped. Mr. Miller, the cancer has spread to her lungs. We can try a more aggressive approach, but I need to be honest with you. We're running out of options." Daniel felt the floor sway beneath him. After months of treatments, of watching his little girl endure pain no child should ever have to face, of holding her hand through countless procedures and whispering promises that everything would be okay, they had reached the moment he had feared. "Most how long?" he managed to ask, his voice cracking. Dr. Ramirez placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Weeks, possibly a month." "I'm so sorry, Daniel." Daniel nodded mechanically, years of military training keeping him upright when all he wanted was to collapse. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before returning to Sophie's room. Inside, his daughter was transfixed by the tablet screen, where Patrick Mahomes was executing an impossible throw, threading the football between 3 defenders to find his receiver in the end zone. "See that, Daddy?" Sophie exclaimed, not noticing the red rim around her father's eyes. "That's what I'm going to do when I grow up. Be just like Patrick Mahomes. They'll call me Sophie the Brave." Daniel sat beside her, taking her small hand in his. "Sophie the Brave," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "That fits you perfectly." That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Daniel stood by the window, watching the city lights blur through his tears. His daughter was dying, and there was nothing he could do to save her. All the battles he had fought, all the training he had endured, and he was powerless against the enemy invading his daughter's body. As he turned to look at Sophie's sleeping form, he noticed her fingers still clutched her favorite Patrick Mahomes action figure, a gift from her mother before she had passed away 3 years earlier. The sight of Sophie's unwavering faith in her hero broke something inside him. "I wish," he whispered to the empty room. Just one wish to make her happy. Before he couldn't finish the thought. The next morning, Emily Carson, The nurse, who had been with Sophie since her diagnosis, found Daniel hunched over a notepad in the hospital cafeteria. His coffee sat untouched beside him, as he wrote furiously, crossing out lines and starting over. "Letter writing?" Emily asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Her kind eyes had seen countless families go through this nightmare, but something about the Millers had gotten under her skin. Perhaps it was Sophie's indomitable spirit. Or maybe it was Daniel's quiet strength. A single father who never left his daughter's side. Daniel looked up, the dark circles under his eyes more pronounced than ever. "It's stupid," he said, pushing the notebook away. "I'm writing to Patrick Mahomes. Sophie's dying wish is to meet him. And his voice broke. "I just want to give her this one thing." Emily reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "It's not stupid, it's beautiful." "It's hopeless," Daniel corrected her. "He probably gets thousands of these requests. Why would he care about one more sick kid?" "Because, Sophie isn't just one more sick kid," Emily said firmly, "and you're not just another desperate parent. Tell her story, Daniel. Tell him about Sophie the Brave." That evening, as Sophie slept fitfully, Daniel finished his letter. It wasn't eloquent or poetic. Just the raw truth of a father watching his daughter fade away, holding on to one final dream. "Dear Mr. Mahomes, my name is Daniel Miller. I'm writing to you about my daughter Sophie. She's 8 years old and has been battling stage 4 neuro. For the past 18 months, the doctors have told me that she doesn't have much time left. Sophie calls herself Sophie the Brave because of you. She watches your games and says, if Patrick Mahomes can be that tough and never give up, then she can too. You've given her strength when I couldn't. Her one wish is to meet you. I know you must get thousands of requests like this. And I know the chances of you even seeing this letter are slim to none, but I had to try for Sophie. She doesn't ask why this is happening to her. She doesn't complain about the pain or the treatments. She just holds on to her dream of meeting you, and it keeps her fighting. If there's any way you could spare even 5 minutes for a video call, it would mean everything to her and to me, respectfully. Daniel Miller. He included his contact information in the hospital address, then sealed the envelope. The next morning he mailed it, knowing it would likely end up in a pile of fan mail that Mahomes would never see. Days passed with no response. Sophie's condition deteriorated rapidly. The cancer was aggressive, spreading through her small body like wildfire. The doctors increased her pain medication, and Sophie spent more time sleeping than awake. But in her lucid moments, she still asked about Patrick Mahomes, still insisted on watching his games. Still, whispered Sophie the Brave. When the pain became too much, Daniel felt himself breaking. He had failed his daughter. He couldn't save her life. And he couldn't even give her this one simple wish. One evening, as Sophie slept, Emily found Daniel in the hallway, his head in his hands. I never should have written that letter, he said, not looking up. I got her hopes up for nothing. Emily sat beside him, her clipboard clutched her chest. Daniel, would it be okay if I tried something? He looked up, confusion crossing his face. What do you mean, the letter? Would it be okay if I shared Sophie's story? There are ways to get messages out there now. Ways that might reach him. Daniel hesitated. He was an intensely private person. Hardened by military service, in the early loss of his wife, the thought of strangers knowing their pain made him uncomfortable. But for Sophie, do whatever you think might help. He finally said, we don't have much time left. Emily nodded, her eyes filled with determination. That night, after her shift, she took a picture of Daniel's letter, which he had shown her, and posted it on her social media account, with a simple caption, this little warrior has one dream. To meet her hero, Patrick Mahomes. Time is running out. Let's help Sophie the Brave get her wish. She tagged Patrick Mahomes and added hashtag Sophie the Brave, hashtag last wish, hashtag help Sophie meet Patrick. Emily didn't expect much, maybe a few shares from friends and family. But something about Sophie's story resonated with people. By morning, the post had been shared thousands of times. By afternoon, celebrities were reposting it. News outlets picked up the story. Hashtag Sophie the Brave was trending. The world had heard Sophie's story, and the world was responding. 3 days after Emily's post went viral, Sophie was having one of her bad days. The pain medication made her drowsy and confused, and she drifted in and out of consciousness. Daniel sat by her side, reading aloud from her favorite book, even though he wasn't sure she could hear him. Emily burst into the room, her eyes wide with excitement. "Daniel, check your phone. Check your email, check everything." Daniel frowned. "What's going on?" "Just check," Emily insisted, practically bouncing with anticipation. Daniel pulled out his phone and saw dozens of missed calls and messages. His email inbox was flooded. Before he could make sense of any of it, his phone rang in his hand. An unknown number. "Hello?" He answered cautiously. "Is this Daniel Miller?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is he." "Mr. Miller, my name is Samantha Hayes. I'm Patrick Mahomes' assistant. He received your letter and has seen the social media campaign. He would like to speak with you directly." Daniel's hand began to shake. "Ah, yes." Of course, there was a pause. And then a different voice came on the line, deeper, instantly recognizable from television interviews and commercials. "Mr. Miller, this is Patrick Mahomes." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "Mr. Mahomes, I thank you for calling. Please call me Patrick. I saw your letter in Emily's post. I'm so sorry about Sophie. I'd like to come see her if that's okay with you today." If possible. Daniel could barely process what he was hearing. "You want to come here in person?" "Absolutely no cameras. No publicity, just me, for Sophie." Daniel looked at his daughter. Pale and small, in her hospital bed. She would love that more than anything in the world. They made arrangements quickly. Patrick would arrive later that afternoon, through a private entrance to avoid drawing attention. Daniel hung up the phone, his hand still trembling. "Is it true?" Emily asked, her eyes shining with tears. "Is he coming?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak after all these months of helplessness. He had finally done something for his daughter. He had given her a miracle. As promised, Patrick Mahomes arrived at the hospital without fanfare. No entourage no cameras. Just a man in jeans and a hoodie. Carrying a small bag, he was directed to Sophie's room, where Daniel waited nervously. Daniel heard footsteps in the hallway and then a voice, when he had heard countless times through the television, but never expected to hear in person. "All right, where's Sophie the Brave?" Daniel's head snapped up. Standing in the doorway was Patrick Mahomes himself. His signature smile, warm and genuine. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. Couldn't speak. This wasn't a dream. This was real. Sophie stared at the sound of the voice. Her tired eyes fluttered, open, and for a moment, she didn't move. She just stared as if processing what she was seeing. Her tiny hands gripped the blanket tightly. "Patrick Mahomes," she whispered. Her voice so small, it was barely audible. Patrick's face softened as he stepped into the room. "That's me, kiddo." Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she reached out, her frail hands trembling. She looked to her father for confirmation. But Daniel, too overwhelmed to speak, could only nod. Patrick sat down beside her, pulling up a chair and leaning in close. "You know, I met a lot of tough people in my life. But I hear you're tougher than all of them." Sophie let out a shaky laugh. "I try," she whispered. "No, you don't. Just try," Patrick corrected her gently. "You do it, that's why they call you Sophie the Brave." "Right?" Sophie nodded, her eyes never leaving his face, as if afraid he might disappear if she looked away. "Well, I think that's a perfect name for you," Patrick continued, "because being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about facing the scary stuff anyway. And that's what you do every day." Sophie's smile grew wider. "That's what you do too. When the other team is winning." Patrick laughed, a genuine sound that filled the room. "You're absolutely right. Mind if I stick around for a while? I heard you're my biggest fan, and I could use some tips from an expert." Sophie's eyes lit up, in a way Daniel hadn't seen in months. "You want my advice?" "Absolutely," Patrick said, settling in as if he had all the time in the world. "I hear you know every play I've ever made." What was meant to be a brief visit stretched into hours. Patrick didn't just sit and talk. He engaged with Sophie, completely. He asked her opinions on plays, listened to her advice on his throwing technique, and even let her teach him a new celebration that she had invented during her long hospital stays. Daniel watched in amazement as his daughter transformed before his eyes. The girl who had been too weak to sit up that morning was now animated, laughing, her cheeks flushed with excitement rather than fever. For these precious hours, Sophie wasn't a sick child. She was just a girl meeting her hero. "You know what," Patrick said, after Sophie had expertly broken down his last game, Play-by-play. I think the Chiefs need a new strategy consultant. What do you say, Sophie? Want to join the team? Sophie giggled. The sound Daniel had feared he might never hear. Again, I can't leave the hospital. She reminded him details. Details. Patrick waved his hand dismissively. We'll bring the team to you. Virtual consultant. I'll have my people set up a special line just for you. Sophie's eyes widened. Really? Really, Patrick promised. Then he reached for the bag he had brought with him. But every team member needs their own gear, right? Sophie nodded solemnly. Close your eyes. Patrick instructed when Sophie complied. He pulled something out of the bag and placed it gently in her lap. Okay, open them. Sophie opened her eyes and gasped. In her lap was a miniature version of Patrick Mahomes' signature football helmet. Customized with her name, Sophie the Brave. Embroidered in gold across the front. Is this really mine? She whispered, running her fingers over the letters. It's not just yours, kid. You earned it, Patrick said softly. Real champions don't need a trophy to prove they're strong, but sometimes it's nice to have a reminder. Sophie clutched the helmet to her chest. Overwhelmed, Daniel turned away, wiping his eyes discreetly. The simple kindness of this gesture was almost too much to bear. But Patrick wasn't done. He pulled out his phone and gestured for Daniel to join them. I want to take a picture if that's okay. Daniel nodded, moving to Sophie's side. Patrick positioned himself next to Sophie's bed and held up his phone. Wait, he said, handing the helmet back to Sophie. Put it on with trembling hands. Sophie placed the helmet on her head. It was too big, sliding down over her eyes. But her smile beneath it was radiant. Patrick took several photos, then switched to video mode. Listen up, people, he said, speaking into the camera. I want everyone watching this to meet someone way tougher than me. This is Sophie the Brave, and she's the strongest fighter I've ever met. He turned the camera to Sophie, who waved shyly from beneath her helmet. Sophie here has been giving me some game advice, and let me tell you, she knows her stuff. So from now on, if we win, you know who to thank. He winked at Sophie, who giggled when he finished recording. Patrick turned back to Sophie. Now the world knows your name, kid. Just like I promised. Sophie's eyes filled with wonder as she realized what was happening. Patrick Mahomes had just introduced her to the world. As the evening progressed, Sophie began to tire. The excitement had drained what little energy she had, and her eyelids grew heavy. Patrick noticed immediately. I think it's time for me to go, he said gently. Champions need their rest. Sophie fought against her exhaustion. Will you come back? She asked, her voice small and uncertain. Patrick took her hand, his expression serious. I will. That's a promise, Sophie the Brave. And I always keep my promises. As Patrick prepared to leave, he took Daniel aside. Mr. Miller, Daniel, I meant what I said. I'll be back and I want to do more. Would it be okay if I call you tomorrow to discuss some ideas? Daniel, still processing the events of the day, could only nod gratefully. Thank you, he managed. You've given us both. Patrick squeezed his shoulder. No thanks needed. It's an honor to know Sophie. After Patrick left, Sophie fell into the deepest, most peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks. Daniel sat beside her, watching her chest rise and fall, the miniature helmet still clutched in her arms. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to hope not for a miracle cure, but for his daughter's remaining time to be filled with joy instead of pain. True to his word, Patrick called the next day. The conversation was brief but impactful. Patrick wanted to establish a foundation in Sophie's name to help children fighting cancer, and to make sure that no warrior fought alone. He wanted Daniel's permission and input. Why? Daniel asked, still struggling to understand why this famous athlete would go to such lengths. For his daughter, Patrick's response was simple. Because Sophie matters and her fight matters. And there are other kids out there who need to know they matter too. The Sophie the Brave Foundation was announced the following week. Patrick Mahomes made the announcement himself, standing before a sea of reporters with a solemn expression that silenced the room. Today I'm announcing the creation of the Sophie the Brave Foundation, he began. Named after one of the strongest people I've ever had the privilege to meet. He went on to explain the foundation's mission to provide support for children with cancer and their families, to fund research, and to create moments of joy for kids fighting impossible battles. the foundation would have a special focus on fulfilling wishes for children with terminal diagnoses. No child should have to face these battles, Patrick said, his voice firm. But until we find a cure, we can make sure they don't fight alone. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Donations poured in. Other athletes and celebrities pledged their support. Hashtag Sophie the Brave became a rallying cry for pediatric cancer awareness. In her hospital room, Sophie watched the announcement on television, her thin face alight with joy. "Daddy, did you hear they named it after me?" Daniel nodded, his heart full. "That's because you're special, so you inspire people." Sophie considered this with a thoughtful expression. That made her seem far older than her 8 years. "I'm not special because I'm sick," she said finally. "I'm special because I don't let it stop me from being brave." Daniel couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. His daughter, in her wisdom and courage, had taught him more about life than all his years of military service ever had. In the days that followed, Sophie's condition continued to decline. The cancer was aggressive, and her small body was tired from fighting. But something had changed. There was a peace about her now, a sense of purpose that transcended her illness. Patrick visited again, as promised, and again after that. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a signed football, a team jersey, photos of the players holding up Sophie the Brave signs. Other times he simply came to sit with her, to talk, to be present in the moment she had left. News of Sophie's story spread. Letters and cards arrived from all over the country, from other children with cancer, from survivors, from families who had lost their own warriors. Sophie read each one, insisting on responding personally, even when it exhausted her. "They need to know they're not alone," she explained to Daniel, "just like Patrick showed me." One evening, as Daniel sat reading the latest batch of cards to Sophie, her breathing became labored. He called for the nurse immediately. Dr. Ramirez arrived minutes later, her face grave as she examined. "Sophie, I think it's time to call anyone who should be here," she said quietly to Daniel. Daniel nodded, his world collapsing around him. He stepped into the hallway to make the calls, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. Emily was already on her way. Patrick Mahomes was in another state for a game, but promised to fly back immediately when Daniel returned to the room. Sophie was awake, her eyes clear despite the pain medication. "Daddy," she whispered. "Don't be sad." Daniel took her hand, forcing a smile through his tears. "I'm not sad, squirt. I'm proud, so proud of my brave girl." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "Will they remember me after I'm gone?" "Oh, Sophie." Daniel's voice broke. "The whole world will remember you." Patrick made sure of that. "The foundation, all those letters. You've touched so many lives." Sophie smiled weakly. "Good. Because I want other kids to know they can be brave too." Daniel stayed by her side as night fell, reading to her, talking to her, simply being with her. Emily arrived and sat quietly in the corner, offering her presence without intruding on these precious moments. In the early hours of the morning, as dawn began to break outside the hospital windows, Sophie's breathing changed. Daniel knew with the terrible certainty of a parent that these were her final moments. "Daddy," Sophie whispered, her voice so faint he had to lean close to hear. "I'm not scared." Daniel held her hand tightly. "That's because you're brave, Sophie. The bravest person I've ever known." Sophie's lips curved into a small smile. Her eyes drifted closed. "Sophie the Brave," she murmured, and then with a gentle sigh, she was gone. Daniel held his daughter's body, rocking back and forth as sobs tore through him. Emily approached quietly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. There were no words for this moment, no comfort that could reach the depth of his grief. Patrick Mahomes arrived an hour later, having flown through the night to keep his promise to Sophie. When he learned he was too late, he sat with Daniel in silence, sharing the weight of loss. "She changed me," Patrick said finally. "I came here thinking I was doing something good for a sick kid. But she's the one who gave me something: perspective, courage, purpose." Daniel nodded, understanding perfectly. That was Sophie always giving, even when she had every reason to take. The funeral was small as Daniel had wanted, but the impact of Sophie's life continued to ripple. Outward, the Sophie the Brave Foundation grew, helping hundreds of children and their families. Patrick Mahomes wore a Sophie the Brave wristband during every game, touching it before each play. as a reminder of what true courage looked like. A year after Sophie's death, Daniel stood before a crowd at the opening of the Sophie the Brave wing at the hospital, where his daughter had spent her final days. The new pediatric oncology center was designed to be bright and hopeful, with murals of superheroes on the walls, in comfortable spaces for families to stay together. My daughter once told me that being brave isn't about not being scared, Daniel said, his voice strong, despite the emotion behind his words. It's about facing the scary stuff anyway. Sophie faced the scariest thing imaginable. And she did it with a smile and a determination to help others. He looked out at the crowd, at the many faces touched by his daughter's story. Emily, who had helped make Sophie's wish come true. Patrick Mahomes, who had kept his promise to ensure Sophie was never forgotten. Families of other children fighting their own battles against cancer. Sophie may have lost her fight, Daniel continued, but her legacy wins every day. Every child who finds hope here, every family who feels less alone, every moment of joy in the midst of pain, that's Sophie the Brave, still fighting, still winning. As he finished speaking, a small girl in a wheelchair approached, wearing a miniature helmet with Sophie the Brave embroidered across the front. She held out a drawing to Daniel, a stick figure with a cape surrounded by stars. "I drew this for you," she said shyly. "The nurse told me about Sophie," she said. "Sophie helps watch over all this brave kids." Now, Daniel knelt down to the girl's level, taking the drawing with trembling hands. "Thank you," he said softly. "I think she does too." As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Daniel remained, looking up at the sign bearing his daughter's name. The pain of losing her would never fade completely, but alongside it now grew a sense of purpose, a continuation of Sophie's fight. The world remembered Sophie the Brave, and in remembering her, found the courage to face their own battles. With the same unwavering spirit that had defined her short but impactful life, Sophie's legacy lived on. Not just in the foundation or the hospital, Wayne, but in every child who found strength in her story, in every parent who held their child a little tighter, in every life touched by the ripple effect of one brave little girl who refused to let cancer define her. In the end, Sophie had gotten her wish and so much more. She had met her hero, yes, but more importantly, she had become one herself.